Someone can sit there. I'm not going to sit there.
I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the center, and we're very pleased you're all here this afternoon, and especially pleased that Kate Doyle is with us from Washington. She really doesn't need an introduction. The work she's done speaks so clearly in the area of transparency and accountability. She is a senior analyst on the U.S. and Latin America at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C. She directs the work on Mexico and Guatemala at the National Security Archive. But that formal description, or even a much longer description, doesn't really tell you who she is or what she's done. I think the talk will do that, but in my view, Kate has played a defining role on issues of transparency and accountability, certainly in the Americas, but more broadly than that, and shown the importance of these issues to broader questions of democracy, democratization, and a whole range of other political issues. So please join me in welcoming Kate Doyle.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Harley and Beatriz and everybody at class for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's so great to see all your faces. I see students, I see professors, and I see people who probably aren't with Berkeley. That's really exciting. It's a great audience, and thank you for coming. I want to talk today about an issue that the National Security Archive has been working on for more than 25 years now, and that is the fundamental right to know about what our governments do and how they do it. Specifically, because I'm a Latin American analyst at the archive, my work focuses on the right to information in Latin America, the right of citizens all over the region. There's a familiar trope in the studies of recent Latin American history that any of you who have been working on Latin America will be familiar with, and that is the idea of the disappeared, the forced disappearance of citizens, the snatching of men and women off the streets, the disappearance of these people from one day to the next by forces of the state who are never identified, they are never named, and they are never brought to justice. One of the areas of work that I have been most involved in and that the archive works the hardest on is the disappearance of history, the disappearance of the archives. And just as when peace is finally signed, peace accords are signed in countries like Guatemala or Argentina or Chile, and the country begins to move into some kind of more democratic form of governance, then people begin to ask what happened to our loved ones, and the exhumation teams begin to spread over the country and dig up the mass graves to try to find the bodies, identify the bodies. So do the forensic archivists, the investigators, and now increasingly the prosecutors and the judges look for the buried archives that the state has held onto throughout the period of violence and withheld from the same citizens who have cried out for information about the disappearance of their loved ones. The forensic archivists, the investigators, the prosecutors are looking for these archives to now bring them to light, not only for truth-seeking purposes, not only for historical accountability, but now increasingly in Latin America for judicial accountability and for prosecutions. In Latin America, there is now an emerging consensus about the importance of the right to information to human rights and accountability struggles. You see this in the rising demands for transparency, for information, for archives. That there has been a movement in Latin America over the last 10 years to pass freedom of information legislation, to pass laws that will give citizens the right to demand information from their own governments. You've seen slowly, slowly the opening of archives in places like Paraguay, in Argentina, in Mexico, and most recently in Guatemala. And you've seen increasingly the potential that government records have, that information has, for prosecutions and for judicial accountability. In December, the Inter-American Court for Human Rights in San Jose made a ruling stating that the state of Brazil was responsible for the disappearance of some 60-plus Araguaia guerrillas in the 1970s. And responding to the demands of the family members, the relatives of the disappeared guerrillas, the court ruled that Brazil had a legal obligation within the Inter-American conventions that it was a signatory to produce the records on those disappearances, to produce the records on the targeting of those guerrillas, their surveillance, their kidnapping, and their executions. The court made some of the most acute or explicit statements to date in the record of the Inter-American Commission and court rulings about the obligations of the state to open the files about grave human rights crimes or crimes against humanity. And it's a very, very important precedent, and I think will become a critical ruling for human rights organizations to lean on in the coming years. Despite what I identify as an emerging consensus about the importance of the right to information, there still needs to be some kind of paradigmatic shift or new transformation in how we think about the right to know, the right to truth. Because even today, the openness activists, the advocates for transparency, who often work from the sort of realms of anti-corruption or the right to information about the social services, don't speak to the human rights community and vice versa. They haven't yet figured out how important and how mutually reinforcing their work is. And I think that's one of our challenges in the coming years, is to get that conversation going. The National Security Archives experience working with truth commissions since the early 1990s, trying to get first the declassified US records through the Freedom of Information Act here, and from the United States archives, and slowly, as these archives have been opening around the region, records from countries like Argentina and Chile into the hands of the investigators at the truth commissions. Our work with the investigators and with the prosecutors who are putting together cases, trials of perpetrators, has taught us the power of the information. It brings relief to family members. It confirms and clarifies survivor accounts, which for so long have been the only real accounts of the massacres, the kidnappings, and the torture. It has begun to help scholars and historians rewrite new historical narratives in countries like Guatemala, where the state denied for so long that it had any role in the atrocities that took place for more than 30 years. It helps establish accountability. It can feed ongoing investigations. It can contribute to prosecutions and convictions. And ultimately, I think that the opening of information related to human rights crimes can help strengthen the rule of law and empower national justice systems, which is the objective of this game. Over the last few years, we've seen convictions in cases, hundreds of cases in Argentina and Chile and Uruguay. We saw the conviction of the former president of Peru, Alberto Fujimori, in 2009, and the cases go on. What I wanted to do today is to show you some images and talk about some of the experiences we've had to give you a sense of how states have controlled information, tried to bury information, and how investigators and brave activists and family members are going after those files and bringing them to light. We've found in our work that those in power all over Latin America will go to huge lengths to hide the truth about the past. One of the images I wanted to show you was a page from a municipal logbook in a tiny village in Guatemala called Panzos, where there was a massacre in the 1970s. The massacre happened when a military unit arrived to crush a protest that local farmers were having about land grabs in their area. And in the course of the aggression on the part of the military, dozens of people were shot and killed. Others drowned in the river trying to flee the violence. When a group of prosecutors and human rights activists went to Panzos to investigate the killings, they had gotten advance word from someone who lived in the municipality in the area that the town of Panzos kept a huge ledger, the way many small towns do, where they recorded all of the occurrences of daily life, that Juan Tamayo came and complained about the burro of his neighbor who broke down the fence and trampled his corn, and that would be, or a wedding took place, or someone was arrested for drunkenness, and that would be recorded in the ledger. And when the investigators got to Panzos and asked for the ledger, the 2 pages that were for the day of the massacre had been scribbled out. They weren't torn out, because on the other sides of these pages were important daily occurrences for the municipality, and they didn't want to destroy those. But the 2 pages were scribbled out, and I don't know if you can sort of see from this fuzzy image the quality of the scribbling, the intensity of the scribbling. Somebody took a pen, or maybe 20 pens, and spent probably days going over those words with tiny ink circles. I actually got an a retired FBI document specialist to come to Guatemala and examine the ledger underneath infrared and all kinds of light, special equipment that he had. And he spent 8 hours trying to penetrate that ink, and he wasn't able to do it. That is the intensity of the cover-up that has taken place in Latin America. Of course, it's not just in Guatemala. This is a U.S. document. This is a U.S. document that is now more than 50 years old. This is from the 1954 overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. It's part of a set of documents that were called the assassination plans that took place in the couple of years leading up to the coup in 1954, which the CIA supported and engineered, really. What's amazing about these documents to me is when they were declassified some 15 years ago, and at the archive we were waiting eagerly for the 3 boxes of documents that were coming to us. I mean, these documents now, 50 plus years old. The CIA at this point, it was the late 1990s, was trying to kind of show how it could be open now that the Cold War was over and there was no real rationale for it being around. They were sort of trying to come up with a different tact, and a sort of public relations, a new public relations department was established, and part of that process was they opened a whole bunch of documents about historical covert operations, one of them being 1954 coup of Arbenz. And yet when we opened up the documents, there were hundreds of pages that looked like this. These are actually the names of the communists. You can't see that, but it's written up there. The communists in Arbenz's government, or friends of Arbenz, or comrades of Arbenz, or colleagues of Arbenz, who were targeted for assassination. What I wanted to do when I got the documents was to check the names of those who were targeted against the people we know who had been killed during the operation. But I couldn't check that. And we filed a FOIA and we appealed the FOIA, and we never got those names. So it's not only the Latin American governments that is concerned with hiding information about their past. The demand, though, for information is rising in Latin America. As I said, there is a right to information movement that in some way makes the obstacles that still face relatives of the disappeared, for example, even more frustrating, because there's movement, there's sort of a momentum underway, and yet states that claim to be defenders of the human rights of their citizens can still sit on millions of pages of secret archives. They have no legal obligation to open those files. So families who are looking for disappeared loved ones often still don't have access to anything about what happened. Some of them are trying to take matters into their own hand. In Mexico, an amazing woman named Aleida Gallegos, who at the age of 2 lost both her parents to Mexican intelligence service forces when they kidnapped and killed both her parents in 2 separate actions. Aleida went to the National Archives of Mexico, which, thanks to President Fox's decision in 2002, actually now had and still has millions of pages of documents from the internal intelligence services of the old PRI regimes in Mexico. Fox felt that as part of his sort of transition to democracy, openness had to be a part of that. Mexico passed a Freedom of Information law shortly after he took power. He ordered his defense agencies, his intelligence agencies, to turn over records to the National Archives. Aleida went into those records, which were very difficult to use because there's no index, and the archivists are actually quite withholding about letting you see them. But she worked for many, many months, and she found documents about her parents that said that they were being surveilled. It described meetings that they had, restaurants they ate in, phone calls they had. And then there were the documents about the days of their arrest, both separately. Those were the last documents that we know about her parents, are documents in which the intelligence service describes their arrest. She also found out through the archives that she had a brother. She didn't know she had a brother because she had been adopted when her parents were disappeared. And her brother, who was an infant, was adopted by a different family. That family moved to Washington, D.C., and a couple of years after beginning this search, she located him, and they were reunited for the first time in almost 30 years. Aleida has just opened a case before the Inter-American Commission with the documents she found in the National Archives to try to get some measure of justice about the disappearance of her parents. That's not a process that happened in Mexico. There's been no movement to use those archives in that way in Mexico. Even the United States government, although the US does not recognize universal jurisdiction, that sort of legal precept that says that the most heinous crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, systematic use of torture, can be tried anywhere in any country. Some countries like Spain or Belgium or Canada recognize the precepts of universal jurisdiction and have actually had trials of Rwandans and Bosnians and Guatemalans. The United States doesn't, but even the US has recognized this, what Catherine Sicking calls the justice cascade, the importance, the connection between prosecuting the perpetrators, challenging or breaking the back of impunity, and finally establishing rule of law. I was just in Florida a few months ago when one member of a special forces unit called the Caibiles, which was responsible for one of the most horrible massacres in Guatemala in 1982, when about 250 people were killed and thrown down a dry well and left there for decades until someone came and unearthed them. He was found living in the United States. He'd been there for 20 years. He was a citizen. He had children. He's the one on the right, Jordan, Gilberto Jordan. He was a cook in a restaurant. He had 2 cars and a happy life. He had entered the United States in 1986, 4 years after helping to kill those 250 people. The United States now has a special unit that is a combination of prosecutors from the Justice Department and investigators from ICE. It's called the Human Rights Perpetrators Unit. And they are now hunting down perpetrators of human rights atrocities in other countries very selectively, very slowly, very carefully. This is one of the only prosecutions they've actually brought to conviction. But they are finding them. Because we don't recognize universal jurisdiction, they can't try them for the massacres or the kidnappings, but they can try them for naturalization fraud, because Gilberto Jordán did not check the box on the form when he applied for citizenship in this country that said, have you ever persecuted someone or committed a criminal act and not been prosecuted for it? And on the basis of that, they were able to go after him for naturalization fraud. The person on the left is a man named Ramiro Osorio. Ramiro was 5 when he was living in Dos Erres. He saw his entire family killed in front of him. The only reason Ramiro was not killed, he's one of 2 children who survived the massacre, the only people that survived out of about 252. The only reason he survived is because one of the Caibiles who killed his family and his community wanted to adopt him as a kind of a servant. So he was adopted by one of the Special Forces soldiers that destroyed his community and lived as an indentured servant, really, for another 10 or 12 years until he escaped. He lives in Canada now, and he came to Florida to testify against Gilberto Jordán. A very moving and beautiful thing. The United States used declassified US documents as part of the evidence they presented to the judge to convict Jordán not only to 6 months and deportation, which is the normal sentence you get for naturalization fraud, but to 10 years, which is a groundbreaking ruling on that kind of a crime. It's a federal crime, but usually they simply deport. They got 10 years out of the Florida judge because they argued that the aggravating circumstances presented by the crime committed by this person when he lied on the form merited an additional or higher sentence, and the judge agreed. That was in September. That was a real, a landmark ruling. As I was describing before, documents have begun to appear slowly, after decades of denials by the regimes in Argentina and Chile, Brazil, Mexico. In Guatemala, one of the first documents to appear was a now kind of infamous, in Guatemala anyway, military logbook. It's kind of like a logbook where an intelligence unit, a military counterinsurgency unit, an urban unit that in Guatemala is called El Archivo. It's just a nickname, the archive, because it was an intelligence collecting unit, and then it would act on the intelligence and target dissidents, communists, guerrillas, or people that they didn't like. The logbook turned up in 1999 when somebody inside the military stole it and smuggled it out of military archives and put it into someone's hands, who put it into someone's hands, who put it into someone's hands, and who gave it to me and asked me to take it to Washington and make it public because they were frightened to do it in Guatemala. And you can see just from this one page, it's actually about 55 pages, that it documents individuals, men and women. There are actually a couple of children. There are a couple of people in their 80s. There's 183 of them. They were all captured by this unit between 1983 and 85, which was the period of Mejía Victores, for those of you who know Guatemala, when the forced disappearances in the city centers, in Guatemala City and other cities, skyrocketed after the massacres had sort of died down because the massacres were done. And they began to target the infrastructure of the guerrilla and friends and relations. And they would have photographs that they sort of glued into the book, and the person's name and their address. And what's amazing about them for people who lost, a father or a daughter because that person went to a meeting or went outside the house to buy a bottle of milk and then never came back, is that they say the date of the capture, they describe where the person was captured, and it all correlates to what we know about how these people disappeared. And most of the entries have have another date, a second date, that describes their fate. Some of them say they were handed to intelligence units within the Guatemalan army. They're identified. The DI is Dirección de Inteligencia, the big intelligence service unit. Some of them have codes, like this one, which says 300, which I spent 3 months analyzing this document before we made it public. And matching it with human rights reporting and talking to family members, we realized that 300 meant the person was executed. So many of these people were kidnapped, obviously tortured. They were held for months at a time and then executed. And this was documented. This is in a country where when the Truth Commission went to the government in 1997, 8, 9, when it was doing its work, before it issued its report, and said, we need the records. We need to understand how this happened. We're trying to understand historically. They had no legal weight. They weren't allowed to name names. But historically, how did the institutions of the state unleash the kind of violence that left 200,000 people dead and 50,000 people disappeared? How did that happen? And the state, the military, and the national police, and the intelligence said, we don't have documents like that. We don't have documents. They've been destroyed. We never had those documents. We didn't commit those crimes, so we wouldn't have documents about them. They're protected by national security. Or one of my favorite ones, well, that's a Western, that's a first world occupation, the creation of documents. We don't operate that way in Guatemala. We're just not organized enough. We heard that a lot. And they did have documents. These militaries document what they do, just like the Nazis did. And this document is a kind of a chilling, it's a chilling piece of evidence from inside the killing machine. It says very clearly, not just the policy, but how they carried it out. In 2005 in Guatemala, which is the place I work the most, which is why I keep referring to it, something amazing happened. A group of investigators or inspectors, really, from the Human Rights Prosecutor's Office went onto a police base in downtown Guatemala City to follow up on a kind of routine request by neighbors who were worried about the improper storage of ammunition on the base. They were worried that it might explode, that something might happen. They'd heard about it from other neighbors who worked as police and who had seen it. And so inspectors were sent from the Human Rights Prosecutor's Office, because when the neighbors appealed to the mayor to do something, the mayor didn't do anything. And when the neighbors appealed to the police to do something, the police didn't do anything. So eventually they ended up at the Human Rights Prosecutor's Office, who had to send a team of inspectors onto this police base to make sure the ammunition had been removed, as the police said they would do it. And while they were in the course of that routine inspection, they saw a cluster of sort of deteriorating houses or buildings and asked what was in them. And the police opened the doors, and they found a treasure trove, although a horribly sort of deteriorating treasure trove of documents, of files of the old national police, which had been abolished by the peace accords. The national police in Guatemala were so inextricably intertwined with the worst violence that was carried out during the conflict that the peace accords actually ordered them disbanded, that they were not reformable. They didn't order the army disbanded. They didn't even order the Directorate of Intelligence disbanded. But the national police actually had to be abolished. And they built a new national civil police, which operates all on the same basis. But this turned out to be the historical archive of the National Police of Guatemala. The archive was found in a horrific condition. It was inside buildings that had broken windows and leaky roofs, and so there was water all over the papers, and there were molds, and there were rats, and there were cockroaches. It was disgusting. I went and saw them when they still looked like this. There were little trees growing up out of the floor. I mean, these buildings had not been touched for years. There were old rusty file cabinets and packets and packets and packets. These documents actually go back to the very end of the 19th century, when the National Police were founded, and all the way up to 1997, when the National Police were abolished. Obviously, the key period is the period from the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, when the police did the most harm. There were other arrest books, surveillance sheets. There were ID cards, they're called fichas, of police officers. There were ID cards of surveillance suspects, surveilled suspects. There were ID cards of orejas, the people who are called ears in Guatemala, the civilian sort of snitches or local spies that are either intimidated into spying for the police or the state or paid. There are thousands of these, people who obviously still live and work in Guatemala City. So that was a real dilemma for the archive to know what to do with that. There were thousands of photos, just like the photos you saw in the military logbook. The prosecutor's office organized a staff of people. This was in 2005. They got millions of dollars from governments like Sweden and Switzerland to organize the documents, to clean them, to painstakingly brush them, to take out each rusty staple, to re-glue the loose photos, to scan the pages. They've now scanned 11 million pages. The entire scanned collection exists inside the Guatemalan Police Archives, which is now a public archive open to anyone, and also in a secure server in Switzerland, so that there is an extra copy in case anything happens to this one. But this is what the archive looks like now, 5 years, 6 years later. It's not as interesting looking, but it's much easier to use. These are files I was showing to a funder, so they have little titles on top. But you can see what they did. They brushed each page. They scanned each page. These documents are now being read. So now that they've been organized, they've been cleaned, they've been scanned, now they're being read. They're not only being read by investigators inside the National Police Archive. The Police Archive last year opened its doors. So anybody, any member of any family, any prosecutor, any historian, any journalist, any American, any Canadian, any Swiss person, anybody can come into the archive and sit in front of a computer and look at any of the 11 million pages with no restrictions. Because the archive felt these documents were so important for people to read, even though people's names are all over them, the victims' names, the perpetrators' names, that under normal archival rules, those names would be carefully hidden and only released to the right people. The archive felt that society as a whole had to understand from the deepest possible way how this happened and why this happened. So the entire archive is now open, and people are beginning to make use of it. Did you want to ask a question?
Is the entire archive been scanned?
No. Oh, no. No, 11 million pages out of about 85 million pages.
Okay.
There's about 8 kilometers of paper in the archive. What they've done is they've tried to focus on 1975 to 85, that period. And that's the material that's been scanned. Recently there was, let me see, I can't remember what my next slide is, an arrest, yes, in the case of the disappearance of a well-known young labor leader named Fernando Garcia, who was kidnapped in 1984. It's a well-known case. I mean, Fernando Garcia was one of many thousands of people who were kidnapped. It's a well-known case because when he was kidnapped, his wife, Ninette Montenegro, launched this incredible, powerful campaign to demanding that he be returned to her. His body, she demanded the files, she demanded his body, she filed hundreds of habeas corpus requests with the police, with the government. She went personally to President Mejia Victores with the baby Alejandra in her arms, begging him to give her information about her husband. She founded the first human rights organization in Guatemala called the Mutual Support Group, the GAM. She went on to a long and amazing career, which she's still very much in the middle of human rights advocacy, of fighting for the rights of mostly in GAM, the women, the widows, the mothers, the daughters of the disappeared. Is now a member of Congress in Guatemala. Years of struggle until investigators in the police archive found documents that told the story of the disappearance of her husband. And in one of the key documents, there are the names of 4 police officers who are recommended by their superior to receive an award for having captured a dangerous guerrilla subversive. And that was Fernando Garcia. This is Fernando, this is Ninette, this is Alejandra. This today is Ninette. This is Alejandra, she's a lawyer. This is Fernando's mother, Amalia. 25 years to the day after he disappeared, a former police officer was captured by the present National Civil Police and brought to Guatemala City and imprisoned. There were 4 names, as I said, on that police archive document. They found 2 of the people. They both were arrested. And a year after this, or a year and a half, last October, those 2 policemen were committed to 40 years to prison for the disappearance of Fernando Garcia. Someone from the police archive came to the trial and testified as an expert and talked about what the archive, what the documents said, chronicling the state's role, these 2 policemen's role in the kidnapping, the abduction of Fernando. It was the first case in Guatemala that ended with a conviction of members of the former government for a human rights crime based on the government's own files. And I'm going to stop with these images, but I wanted to end with kind of the most famous case in Latin America, which is the case of Alberto Fujimori. We don't have Peruvian documents in the case of Alberto Fujimori because Peru is one of those countries that has not opened its archives. Apparently, supposedly, the documents have been disappeared or destroyed in Peru. They say the same thing in Chile. I don't believe it. But we did use declassified US documents in that trial. I'm not going to claim they were central to the trial. There were incredible expert witnesses. There was amazing testimony from the family members of the victims of the 2 massacres for which he was being tried. There was incredible testimony from members of the death squad, the Colima group that Fujimori and Montesinos put together to attack their opponents and kill civilians, as they did in that massacre. But the documents played a very important role, and in the huge 700-page extraordinary ruling that, for anybody interested in human rights law, really is worth a read. In the 700-page ruling by the 3 magistrates in that case, which was finally issued in April of last year, I think, they cited the documents because the documents gave them a confirmation in black and white, in contemporary records that were produced, in this case, by the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Peru, that were never meant to see the light of day. They're secret documents. We obtained them through Freedom of Information Act years later. So they're the internal conversation between the ambassador and the State Department, and they talk very openly about the role of Fujimori's army in the Barrios Altos massacre. And some of these documents actually directly contradict some of the statements made by Fujimori in the case and by his lawyer. So they became very important. This is a kind of a show-offy picture because I'm in it, because I got to testify in this case. But I often show this picture in Latin America because even though my face is the biggest face in it, behind me is Alberto Fujimori. And for Mexicans and for Guatemalans and for Paraguayans and Uruguayans to see a president in a courtroom being forced to stand up in front of his accusers. Behind him are a number of the family members of the disappeared in the the murdered in the Barrio Salto massacre is so extraordinary and so powerful and says so much that that I do like to show that because it conveys some of the significance of that moment. That's a close-up. I don't know why I put that. I will end there. I think, you know, one of the lessons that we've learned in this work with our partners in all of those countries that I described is that the right to truth is at the heart of the human rights struggle for accountability and the rule of law. And we have to demand that right, and we have to force these states to honor their obligation to their citizens. Thank you very much.
For some questions. I know there's quite a bit of us here, so I know there's probably going to be a lot of questions. I would ask that you keep them brief.
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of what the United States has been up to of late, particularly the order by the Bush administration to dramatically expand the scope of documents that cannot be released. Which I understand, if I'm not mistaken, the Obama administration hasn't really done anything to reverse, but has decided to continue this practice as well, too.
The Obama administration, well, President Obama, came into office very first day and signed 3 executive orders about secrecy. And they essentially all said the same thing, that government records belong to the people, that the people have the right to those records, and that the government is obliged to explain why they would withhold anything from the people in clear and explicit terms. It was exactly the opposite message that Bush's Attorney General John Ashcroft sent 1 month after 9/11, when he sent a memo to all of his agencies saying, government records belong to the government. Only under exceptional circumstances should they be released when they concern national security matters. And this Justice Department will back you if you decide to legally withhold information on national security grounds. So the message is very good. And behind the scenes, slowly, the Obama administration, in the form of, you know, assistants and staffers in the executive building and the NSC, have been working with the openness community. There is sort of an openness advocacy community. The National Security Archive is part of it, but there's many organizations, the ACLU, Project for Government Oversight, tons of organizations in Washington, sort of good government organizations, working with the Obama government to try to find new ways to push open the files and to expand the limits, or expand the reach, I should say, of the Freedom of Information Act. I think the problem when it gets down to the agency level is that you have, you know, it's not like that old sort of trite cliche of you turn the wheel and then the giant ocean liner takes, you know, ages to actually turn. It's more like you turn the wheel and then, you know, the giant 95 different ocean liners of the CIA and the Pentagon and the State Department and all these different agencies with all their internal regulations have not responded. You know, there's still this war against terror, this national security umbrella that they're operating under. I think one of the extraordinary messages of the WikiLeaks scandal is the indictment of our information system, of our secrecy. And I can only say that the Obama government, not only judging on the executive orders, the messages it has sent, but also on the work that it is doing at the staff level to try to change some of the practices that became entrenched under George Bush it is different. It's taking a long time. I think the one sort of aspect that has been shocking to us and very troubling has been the Obama government's determination to continue and expand the state secrets law in trials. And that's been a really disturbing hangover from the Bush years. Direct hangover is the expanded use of the state secrets laws to withhold information from defendants when they stand trial for acts of terror. So that's something that many of us are trying to fight.
I was wondering if you could shed any light on Obama's reaction or our government's reaction to the investigation where that the man, Garçon from Spain, is doing on our human rights violations in Guantanamo.
You mean the fact that we've sent emissaries to Spain to try to negotiate those investigations away?
Yes.
Yeah. The United States, I mean, we were talking about before, the United States does not support or recognize universal jurisdiction, and it's a real problem. The sort of victory of the conviction of Gilberto Jordan for the Dos Erres, not for the Dos Erres massacre, for naturalization fraud with the aggravating circumstances of the massacre to 10 years in federal prison, good, is actually sort of loathed and despised by the family members in Guatemala who want him to go to prison for the massacre. And we weren't willing to do that here. They've just caught, like a week ago, 10 days ago, they've caught a second Caibil, or former sort of special force, this time an officer in Canada, in Alberta. 10 days ago. Today he went to the court in Calgary where he's been taken. He's under arrest for the same crime. The United States has requested they have 60 days to request his extradition, and they've signaled that they will probably do that. If that happens, he will probably be tried in the same way, which, I'm actually part of that case. I'm working with the Justice Department. I support that case in one way, but in this case, because this guy is in Canada, we want the Canadians to go after him because the Canadians recognize universal jurisdiction. So the U.S. is out of step with a lot of countries in refusing to recognize their obligation to prosecute crimes against humanity. So there are other places that can do this.
To know if this continues the investigation, or he's fine with his commissions there trying to stop it.
As far as I know, the investigation continues in a very quiet way.
Thank you for the really amazing presentation. I wanted to know if you could press a little bit more on this concept of justice cascade in the context of Guatemala, and looking at these recent prosecutions, opening of the police archives that are having some effects at the lower level, but in a country where you have former people who could be tried for war atrocities who are running for president, who have stood for president of, I'm thinking Otto Perez Molina and
Rios Montt,
et cetera, and whether you see this affecting that level of impunity in this ideal cascade.
We have not in the past. I'm much more hopeful now because in the ruling against the two policemen, for example, one of the things that the expert from the police archives did was not only to explain the documents that they'd found in the archive that incriminated these four policemen, but to describe graphically, and she actually put up images just like these of the documents they'd found on the screen for the judges to look at, of the documents that describe the chain of command, all the way up to the director of the police and to Mejia Victores, because these documents flow up and down. So the order comes down, they have the documents with the order. Carry out these operations, these counterinsurgency sweep operations on February 18, 1984, capture these kinds of people. They go down to the level of these two poor saps who are like 23. And these agents go out there, these thugs go out there with these orders, and they find Fernando Garcia and they grab him and they hustle him into a van, and then he's taken away. And who takes him away? They don't know who takes him away. They didn't take him away. They captured him. Now, what was interesting in the trial was, in the ruling, the judges actually ordered the Ministerio Público, which is the public prosecutor, kind of like the Attorney General's office, to now take the next step and identify and arrest the superiors, or investigate the superiors. So that was another sort of groundbreaking aspect of that trial. It was not simply the conviction of these officers on the basis of the state's own documents, but the decision of the judges to order the prosecutors to not stop there, but to go after their higher up. So it was an acknowledgement. So that's not to say that, you know, everything's flowers and balloons in Guatemala, hooray. I mean, there's tremendous, tremendous problems, but there's this kind of sort of incremental, bit by bit, sense that we can do this in a place where nobody ever thought they could ever do this. So I have some hope there that the justice cascade will cascade up. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to why certain governments open their archives and why others don't. Is it leaders within the government? Is it an act of civil society? Is it some ongoing connection between the current and past government? What do you think?
Well, if you look worldwide, so you look at the Stasi files or the Nazi files, you look at the South African archives, look at Paraguay, Argentina, look at Mexico. If you look worldwide, you have kind of two different models. One is the sort of political will model, where a leader actually says, I'm going to do this. And the other is the accident, the leak, the smuggling, the stealing, the almost all of Latin America. Is that true? No, that's not true. Guatemala and Paraguay, accidental leak, accidental discovery. Argentina, where the regime was so discredited, of course not by the dirty war, by the Falklands, but okay, whatever, it was so discredited that ultimately it took a while, it took some years, it took these, you know, sort of first prosecutions, then everybody was amnestied, but then there was a second wave of prosecutions, which now is underway. It took a while, it took a truth commission, all that, but eventually the discrediting of the regime and the sort of determination of the new government to sort of take a stand that was outside of that sort of dark period, that would stand for the rule of law. That led to the decision to open, in that case, a very small archive of police files in La Plata, very important. That has led now, though, to a second decision that actually was signed a year ago by the Defense Department in Argentina, that all military records now have to be open. It hasn't happened yet. It's very slow, incremental. But that's about political will, but in the face of historical circumstances. So by the same token, President Fox, whose very existence and power represented change, break from past, you know, rejection of old model, felt that openness, transparent government, a government that spoke to citizens, not like the old PRI, which shunned citizens, which had contempt for citizens, which bought or killed citizens, that had to be part of his government. And so he ordered his agencies to turn these files over. So you get that when you have a regime that has been discredited, that is despised. South Africa is the same. Those records were opened. And then you have the Paraguays and Guatemala, where there's been a very carefully negotiated peace. It's very delicate. Anything could sort of upset the accords, and so you don't get that kind of dramatic political will that leads to that kind of openness. So instead, you get a completely accidental discovery.
But that's still made completely public in Guatemala.
It was because the human rights prosecutor was extremely wily and smart and got a judge's order, and they had sort of 2005. It was 10 years after the peace accords. They had arrived at just enough kind of gloss of democracy that you could get a judge's order that would say, These files are probably valuable for human rights prosecutions. The prosecutor has a right to seize them, to control them. So, there are spaces inside those negotiated and fragile new democratic governments to do that kind of thing.
I'd like to know, there was a period in which the Jesuit priests were killed in El Salvador, the nuns were killed in El Salvador. The thing with Jennifer Harper, his husband, disappearing, and the United States did nothing to help in this pursuit of information about that. And yet people like Elliot Abrams in Montenegro, they're still, is anything ever been done to point out that these people blocked investigations, that they knew about these terrible things when they were happening? Are any of these men ever going to be like Henry Kissinger? Are they ever going to be able?
They're called out, like Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger's been called out.
But he can't leave the country.
Right. And so they're called out. In our country, we don't put them in jail because they're officials of the government and they were carrying out government policy. That's why they're so afraid of the Spanish investigation. They're so afraid of universal jurisdiction, and they will not acknowledge universal jurisdiction because we have a whole bunch of people who will immediately be swept up in universal jurisdiction rulings.
I was wondering if with all this cutting the budget, your job might just happen to be perfectly logical to cut since you're investigating.
Well, luckily I don't work for the government. Despite our very strange government-sounding name, we sue the government all the time, so we do not take money from the government.
I know this might sound like a futuristic look on things, but do you see a growing shift from like hard copy documents to electronic documents? And if so, what will that mean in future human rights cases if those electronic documents can be easily erased?
We have not, in Latin America, in developing countries, we have not yet seen that shift. So, in recent genocides, in the Rwandan genocide, for example, in Sierra Leone, in Kenya, and Liberia, we have documents from those regimes. We have records, paper records in Chad. What has emerged as a challenge, and that will emerge as a challenge, and so that's a new kind of frontier that people aren't quite ready to wrestle with. What has emerged as a challenge in the sort of electronic versus paper debate is there are courts that are uncomfortable about accepting electronic pictures of documents as evidence. So they want to touch the evidence. They want to have the paper. And then, the archivists on the other side are saying, well, we can't give you the paper. The paper's going to get lost in some judicial file in the Ministerio Público and we'll never see it again. So there's actually some work being done in some of the countries where that's been a problem to try to pass legislation that allows judges to recognize electronic copies legally as criminal evidence. To be honest, we are, because the worst of the human rights atrocities took place during periods when paper was still the kind of currency of information, we as an openness community in terms of human rights evidence have not yet grappled with that problem, and we're going to have to do that. It's something that we've wrestled with a bit in the United States, and the National Archives has worked very closely with agencies on trying to define rules and regulations about the preservation of electronic records. And you've seen every president since Ronald Reagan erasing electronic files in the White House as they're exiting. So it's a real problem here. It hasn't become a problem there yet, but it will.
You said at the beginning of your talk that there were two groups that are calling for government transparency, human rights-based groups, and then another group that is calling for government accountability. I was wondering where that second group is coming from. Is that like rule of law, development kinds of interests?
Anti-corruption.
And then how do you think the landscape will be different when those two groups are talking to each other more and working together from how it is now?
The motivations for freedom of information laws are very different in every country. So some laws pass Freedom of Information Acts because a political party just stepped out of power and the new incoming party wants to know information about how that party operated and what was going on. That's actually how the Freedom of Information Law was passed in the United States in 1966. After the long Eisenhower years, the Democrats in Congress wanted a law that would permit them to have access to records about the Eisenhower government to help them understand how the government operated, especially in the McCarthy years, and they were infuriated that they weren't allowed to have information that the government was generating internally, and they weren't, even as members of Congress. So there was 10 years of hearings in the United States to get a FOIA law passed, basically because of, for political purposes. In other countries, it's very rooted in anti-corruption movements, and that's very true for Latin America. It's true for Asia. The Indian FOIA law is all about anti-corruption campaigns. In other laws, it's about sort of oh, sorry, that's my phone. I'll just turn that off. Delivery of social services and the frustrations of communities that, you know, for too long have lived without health services, without schools, and so movements have organize themselves around this principle of transparency because they want to see the budgets. They want to know where is the spending going. So they come out of different motivations. I mean, one of the reasons why I've been trying or working with a coalition of organizations to try to get these two sort of communities of advocates to talk to each other is because the human rights organizations still don't kind of use the right to information instruments that we now have. So there are FOIA laws, and there are human rights groups that could use those FOIA laws to get government to get records about the military or the police or human rights abuses, and they're not using them. They don't know how to use them. They're difficult to use. They have to appeal them. And the openness community, on the other hand, has a whole skill set about what these laws are about, how they work, how you appeal them, but they're not talking to the human rights community about it. So I think it's just, it's a part of trying to get the right instruments into the hands of the advocates who need them.
Spain recently rewrote their laws to give themselves more discretion under what cases they would receive under international jurisdiction. Do you know the reason they did this? Was it because they were bringing cases against George Bush and company, or was there
actually Israel? I mean, there was an Israel case that really upset everybody. The other thing is a whole bunch of cases landed in Spain, and it was a little bit overwhelming. I mean, it's a trend. It's first of all,
countries that recognize universal jurisdiction are slowly but surely rewriting their laws to limit
it.
people, you know, in different ways, to their own citizens being victims, or the perpetrator having some connection,
or the country having a historical relationship to the country. You know, I mean, obviously there were political reasons to do this, and Spain is also wrestling with its own legacy of the Civil War. So it's a very complex circumstance that produced those reforms or changes. But part of the reason was that there has been a little bit of an avalanche of cases in Spain, and you've got Rwanda, and you've got former Nazi cases, and you've got an Israel case that upset everybody, and you've got tons of Latin America cases, and the Spanish Parliament sort of went, oh my God, you know, this is too much. And we're becoming now this sort of one-stop shop for anybody's crimes against humanity. So, I mean, what does that say? That says we have to use the reformed laws. We think we can. I mean, many of the Latin America cases fit perfectly within even those sort of reformed version of the universal jurisdiction legislation, and we have to, and other countries have to use this too, and have those trials as well, as Canada has.
Are there many other countries that are actually using those laws?
There are a number. There's a handful. Yeah, there's Italy, there's Belgium, there's Spain, there's Canada, but there's a handful. So it's slowly. Some countries are doing that.
So I mean, because you're talking about the landscape, I think it's just interesting to point out our relationship. You know, I'm the acting director of the Human Rights Clinic. We're actually lead counsel on the case of the Guatemalan document that Kate mentioned. We represent 129 family members.
That military logbook with the photographs of the disappeared is now a case that is in the Inter-American Commission, but is about to go to the Inter-American Court. And Roxana Altos and her students, as well as an organization, human rights organization in Guatemala called the Fundación Mirdamac, and the National Security Archive have all been involved in putting this case together for 6 years now.
And Kay is our expert witness, and she has really educated us on some of the subtleties of habeas data laws, some of the subtleties of access to information, and she will, when we get before the court, also educate, we hope, the court and the Inter-American system more on the scope and the reach of this, what we call the right to truth, and help the court provide content that human rights norm. And I know you've been an expert witness in a lot of the cases that you're talking about, so I just wanted to point out that's where some of the information sharing is occurring.
Yeah, and the Brazil case that was recently ruled in December on Araguaia is going to be a really key precedent for us in this military logbook case.
We have time for one more question, so go right ahead.
I'm just wondering about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and whether that plays a part in this, or if you provide evidence of them, or is it starting to work now that it's been set up, or your feelings about it?
The ICC's focus is on atrocities that are unfolding right now. So I have a lot of colleagues who work on information gathering and statistical analyses that have performed or presented before the ICC. My own work is in working with investigators on past human rights abuses in Latin America, and they can't, by their mandate, look at past human rights abuses. That's why they're trying to take place. Well, we're either trying to get them to take place at the Inter-American level, or much better, obviously, at the national level. But the ICC is part of the justice cascade in that, you know, that phrase kind of indicating this idea that you've got justice going on in one form or another at all different levels. So you've got the international level that may or may not lead to an actual conviction and jailing, but the pressure that it puts, the tremendous pressure it puts for a whole complex set of reasons, you know, shaming, kind of reviving interest in the country, the pressure it puts on national level judicial systems to move, to act, has been really useful. And that's the same with the Inter-American Court, which can't even put people in jail. And yet, those international or regional level processes tend to put a tremendous amount of pressure on local justice systems, and often that will lead to cases going to trial for the first time.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Flossie.